In 1347, as the Black Death began its devastating sweep across Europe, strange ships started appearing in port cities. These were no ordinary vessels. They arrived with no living crew, only rotting corpses, rats, and fleas. These death ships had drifted from the Crimean port of Caffa to Messina, Sicily, and then on to Marseille, Venice, and beyond. The rats and fleas aboard carried the bubonic plague, a disease that would go on to kill tens of millions, wiping out nearly half of Europe's population within just a few years. These ghostly ships became symbols of doom, floating coffins that silently delivered death to every harbor they touched. They weren't warships or pirate vessels. They were plague ships, and their arrival marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in human history. In the autumn of 1347, the harbor of Messina, Sicily, stirred with its usual rhythms of medieval commerce. Merchant vessels from the Levant unloaded silks and spices, sailors shouted across the wharves, and townsfolk hurried to markets heavy with the scents of fish, wine, and garlic. Yet among the expected ships, there appeared a sight so unnatural, so horrifying, that it would be seared into memory as an omen of the apocalypse. A handful of vessels drifted into port, their sails tattered, their decks eerily quiet. As the Sicilians approached, expecting to greet merchants or soldiers, they found only silence. Silence broken by the sound of rats scurrying over abandoned cargo. The crews lay sprawled upon the planks, their bodies swollen, blackened, and oozing with buboes. There was no life aboard, only death. These were the death ships, and their arrival marked the beginning of a nightmare that would engulf Europe. To the citizens of Messina, it must have seemed as though the ships themselves were cursed, ghostly harbingers sent by some malevolent force. No one aboard answered hails. No captain appeared to negotiate docking rights. Instead, the vessels, driven by wind and tide, slid into harbor like coffins borne by unseen hands. When the brave, or the desperate, ventured aboard, the reality revealed itself. Entire crews had been wiped out mid-voyage. Cargo remained untouched, ropes coiled, sails tied. But the bodies told another story. Some sailors lay where they had fallen, their skin blotched and their throats choked with blood. Others had crawled toward water casks, dying with their hands stretched out in futility. The smell of decay and sickness permeated the air. To the medieval mind, this was not merely disease, it was damnation. Unbeknownst to those who recoiled in horror, the true threat was not the corpses, but the living vermin that skittered in the shadows. Rats, their bellies swollen from feeding on grain, carried fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the bubonic plague. Each flea was a tiny needle of death, capable of transmitting the sickness that had already scythed through Asia and now entered Europe with silent ferocity. The plague did not need surviving sailors to spread. It needed only the stowaways in the ship's holds. Thus, as citizens of Messina fled from the ships, the plague fled with them, riding in the fur of rats that poured ashore. Historians trace the origins of these ships to the Crimean port of Caffa, where Genoese merchants had held a trading colony. There, in 1346, the Mongol army of the Golden Horde had besieged the city. According to chronicles, the besiegers, stricken with plague themselves, hurled infected corpses over the city walls in one of the earliest instances of biological warfare. Whether true or embellished, the result was the same. The Genoese fled by sea, desperate to escape the horrors of the siege. Their vessels, however, carried the invisible passengers of pestilence. As they sailed westward, death sailed with them. By the time they reached Sicily, the plague had already consumed their crews. The ships that drifted into Messina were not carriers of commerce, but harbingers of catastrophe. The reaction in Messina was immediate and visceral. Panic spread faster than reason. The authorities, recognizing the danger, expelled the ships, forcing them back to sea. Yet the act was futile. The plague had already slipped into the city through contact with goods, vermin, or the handful of surviving sailors who staggered ashore. Within days, the citizens of Messina began to sicken. Buboes swelled in groins and armpits, fevers raged, and death followed within a week. Families died together in their homes, priests collapsed mid-prayer, and gravediggers fell into the very pits they dug. The attempt to cast out the ships had failed. The curse had already taken root. From Messina, the plague spread outward like fire racing through dry fields. Ships expelled from Sicily drifted north and west, carrying their lethal cargo to Marseille, Genoa, and Venice. Each port repeated the same tragedy, vessels arriving silent and crewless, towns horrified by the sight, authorities attempting to expel them, yet always too late. The rats had disembarked, the fleas had bitten, and the contagion had begun. The ships were merely the first blow. What followed was a tide of sickness that swept across Europe, killing tens of millions and reshaping history itself. To the people of the 14th century, the arrival of the death ships was not explained by bacteria or fleas. Instead, they saw in them the hand of God, the punishment of heaven for sins unrepented. Some believed the vessels were cursed, guided by demons. Others saw them as omens of the Last Judgment, proof that the world was ending. Sailors whispered of phantom crews, of ships guided by spirits of the damned. For a population steeped in superstition, the plague was not merely illness, it was apocalypse. Modern science tells us what they could not know, that the true carriers of plague were rats and fleas, not curses or demons. Yet, even today, the image of the death ship chills the imagination. There is something profoundly unsettling about a vessel arriving with no living soul aboard, its deck littered with corpses, its silence louder than any cannon. It embodies the horror of contagion, the idea that death can travel silently, invisibly, carried by things unseen, striking without warning. The death ships of 1347 were not the first plague vessels, nor would they be the last. Maritime trade has always carried risks of disease, from smallpox to cholera to influenza, yet none have burned themselves into memory so deeply. These ghostly vessels became symbols of the Black Death itself, the floating coffins that heralded the end of medieval Europe's old world. Their arrival in Messina was the spark. What followed was an inferno that consumed a continent. Thus begins the saga of the death ships, the harbingers of plague. They were not warships, yet they conquered kingdoms. They were not pirate vessels, yet they stole more lives than any buccaneer could dream. They were not instruments of empire, yet they reshaped history more profoundly than any emperor's decree. They were ships of death, and their silent arrival in 1347 marked the dawn of Europe's darkest age. Long before the death ships drifted into Messina, their story began on the windswept shores of the Black Sea, at the Genoese colony of Caffa. In the early 14th century, Caffa was one of the most important trading ports in the Crimea, a vital node in the great commercial web that linked Europe with the riches of Asia. Here, merchants from Genoa dealt in spices, silks, furs, and grain, exchanging Mediterranean goods for treasures carried by caravans from the east. It was a place of wealth and tension, for the Genoese presence sat uneasily within the dominions of the Golden Horde, the westernmost khanate of the Mongol Empire. In 1346, that tension exploded into violence. A dispute, accounts vary as to whether it began over the treatment of Muslim merchants or over unpaid debts, gave the Mongol Khan Janibeg pretext to lay siege to Caffa. The Genoese, though far from home, were well fortified. Their walls, built of stone and defended by cannon and crossbow, had repelled attacks before. But Janibeg commanded a vast army, and the siege dragged on with ferocity. For months, the Mongols surrounded the city, cutting off supplies, waiting to starve the defenders into submission. Then came an unexpected ally for the Genoese, plague. The Mongol army, encamped around Caffa, began to sicken. Men fell with fevers and swellings, dying by the thousands. Chroniclers describe how whole units collapsed, how corpses littered the steppe, how the pestilence devoured the besiegers faster than swords or arrows could. It was the Black Death itself, already spreading westward along the trade routes from Central Asia, now striking the Golden Horde. Faced with disaster, Janibeg turned desperation into weapon. According to Gabriele de Musi, an Italian notary whose account is one of the earliest descriptions of the plague in Europe, the Mongols catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the walls of Caffa. The defenders, he wrote, were horrified as the dead rained upon them, spreading stench and sickness. Whether this act of biological warfare truly occurred, or whether the disease entered the city through rats and fleas, remains debated. But in either case, the result was inevitable. The plague breached the walls of Kaffa. Inside the city, panic erupted. As merchants and sailors began to sicken, death stalked the narrow streets and crowded markets. Buboes swelled in groins and armpits. Men coughed blood. Families perished in days. The Genoese, realizing they could not withstand both siege and pestilence, prepared their ships to flee. They loaded what cargo they could, gathered survivors, and slipped out to sea, leaving the plague-devastated city behind them. Yet in their flight, they carried the invisible seed of catastrophe. The vessels that left Kaffa in 1346 and 1347 were not ordinary merchant convoys. They were floating time bombs. Rats scurried in the holds, fleas nestled in their fur, each bite a delivery of Yersinia pestis. As the ships cut across the Black Sea and through the Bosporus into the Mediterranean, death traveled with them. The sailors, trapped in cramped quarters, sickened quickly. Some ships lost entire crews before reaching port, drifting aimlessly with their lethal cargo. Others staggered into harbors with only a handful of survivors, spreading the contagion to all they touched. The story of Kaffa became legend, repeated in chronicles across Europe. To many, it seemed a tale of divine irony. The Mongols, scourge of nations, destroyed by a greater scourge, and in their desperation, passing it to their enemies. Yet to historians, it illustrates the brutal reality of a connected world. Trade routes that enriched Genoa also carried death. Siege warfare that had always been cruel became catastrophic when disease was added. The defenders who fled did not escape. They became unwitting couriers of apocalypse. The symbolism of Kaffa resonated deeply in the medieval imagination. It was a city where East and West met, where merchants, warriors, and pilgrims crossed paths. That it became the gateway for the Black Death into Europe seemed almost inevitable. The siege provided a narrative of origins. The pestilence was not random, but born of conflict, of human cruelty magnified by divine punishment. Priests would later point to Kaffa as proof that sin begets plague, that violence invites God's wrath. To them, the Mongols' act of hurling corpses was not only barbarism, but blasphemy, ensuring damnation for all. Yet science offers a colder explanation. The plague bacterium had been traveling for years, moving slowly from the steppes of Central Asia along the Silk Road, carried by caravans, camels, and rats. Kaffa was simply one of many nodes where disease erupted. Whether or not corpses were catapulted, the fleas and rats aboard Genoese ships would have spread the plague regardless. The death ships were inevitable, their course already set by the invisible logic of biology and trade. Still, the story of Kaffa remains powerful because it captures the terror of those first encounters. Imagine the defenders watching corpses arc over the walls, the bodies bursting upon impact, spilling sickness into the streets. Imagine the sailors, coughing blood as they prepared their ships, knowing that to stay was death, but to flee might spread death further. In that moment, the entire medieval world pivoted toward disaster. The ships leaving Kaffa carried not only cargo and men, but the destiny of continents. By the time they reached Sicily in 1347, Europe's fate was sealed. From Messina, Marseille, Genoa, and Venice, the plague would spread like wildfire, killing tens of millions, unraveling societies, and reshaping faith and culture. But at its root, at the beginning of the chain, lay Kaffa, the city where siege met sickness, where desperation birthed the death ships, where history shifted irrevocably. Thus, Chapter 2 anchors the story in its origins. The death ships were not accidents of fate, but the product of a world already interconnected, already fragile, already vulnerable to forces it could not see. Kaffa was both symbol and starting point, a place where human violence and microbial inevitability converged to unleash one of the darkest chapters in history. When the ghostly vessels from Kaffa slid into the harbor of Messina in October 1347, the city was wholly unprepared for the silent terror they carried. Sicily was no stranger to war or disease. As a crossroads of the Mediterranean, it had seen armies, famines, and fevers. Yet nothing in its long history compared to what came drifting across its waters. Ships whose crews lay blackened and swollen, lifeless, with only the scurry of rats and the whisper of sails in the wind. It was as though death itself had cast anchor. Messina at the time was a bustling port, a jewel of Sicilian trade, its docks crowded with vessels from Genoa, Pisa, Venice, and the Levant. The sight of ships arriving was daily routine. But these were different. As the townsfolk gathered to meet them, they recoiled in horror. No sailors shouted greetings, no merchants came ashore to haggle, no stevedores bustled to unload cargo. Instead, the decks were strewn with corpses. The brave who climbed aboard found scenes of grotesque despair. Sailors with buboes the size of eggs, bodies split open from fever, faces contorted in agony. The stench of rot and sickness clung to the air. The authorities, terrified by what they saw, ordered the ships expelled at once. They believed that by casting out the vessels, they might cast out the evil that had consumed them. The ghostly fleet was forced back to sea, to drift in search of other harbors. Yet the effort came too late. Before the ships departed, rats had scurried ashore, their fleas already spreading the invisible plague. And some sailors, still clinging to life, had staggered onto the docks, collapsing in the streets of Messina. In their breath and blood, death had already entered the city. The outbreak spread with terrifying speed. Within days, families began to sicken. Victims developed fevers, chills, and painful swellings in the armpits and groin. The buboes, black and oozing, gave the disease its grim name, the Black Death. Death followed swiftly, within a week for most, sometimes within days. Physicians, bound by medieval humor's theory, bled patients or applied poultices, but nothing availed. Priests administered last rites until they themselves succumbed. Gravediggers could not keep pace. Corpses piled in homes and alleys, awaiting mass burial. The psychological shock was as devastating as the disease itself. Medieval Europe was steeped in religion and superstition. To the people of Messina, the plague was not explained by rats or fleas. It was punishment from God, a scourge for sins unrepented. Some believed the ghostly ships were cursed, sent by the devil himself. Others thought the stars had aligned to unleash pestilence. Rumors spread of poisoned wells, of Jewish conspiracies, of sorcerers summoning disease. In a time without science, terror bred suspicion, and suspicion bred violence. Messina's panic quickly spiraled. Families abandoned their sick, fleeing to the countryside, yet they carried the plague with them. Refugees spread it to villages and towns, sowing death across Sicily. Merchants, desperate to escape, sailed for Genoa, Marseille, and Venice, turning their vessels into fresh death ships. The attempt to expel the original fleet had failed utterly. The plague was now mobile, carried by every traveler, every rat, every flea. From Messina, the fire had leapt to the dry grass of Europe, and it would burn uncontrollably. Chroniclers of the time captured the horror in words that still chill. Michel de Piazza, a Sicilian notary, described the plague's sudden onset, the speed with which the sick died, and the despair of survivors. So great was the mortality, he wrote, that it seemed as though the human race itself might vanish. Another chronicler noted how whole families died together, their homes locked from outside to contain the stench. Ships floated abandoned in harbors, their crews dead, repeating the cycle of ghostly arrivals. The people of Messina, once prosperous and secure, found themselves prisoners of a doom they could neither see nor understand. Modern historians identify Messina as the first true European outbreak of the Black Death. From this port, the disease radiated outward along the arteries of trade. Its position in the Mediterranean made it a gateway, from Sicily to the Italian mainland, from Italy to France, Spain, and beyond. Messina's tragedy became Europe's catastrophe. Yet to the people of the time, Messina was simply cursed, struck down by divine wrath. Their efforts to flee only carried the curse further. The symbolism of Messina's outbreak remains profound. The city stands as the place where Europe first confronted the full terror of the Black Death, where ghostly ships became symbols of apocalypse, and where the fragility of medieval life was laid bare. The people of Messina believed themselves safe within their walls, protected by faith and fortune. In reality, a handful of vermin and a swarm of fleas were enough to unravel their world. The arrival of the death ships in Messina was more than an outbreak, it was a transformation. It turned trade into terror, ships into coffins, cities into charnel houses. It revealed the vulnerability of a continent interconnected by commerce, yet defenseless against disease. And it marked the beginning of a plague that would kill tens of millions, alter economies, destabilize kingdoms, and scar the very fabric of European memory. Thus, Chapter 3 anchors the story in its first European harbor, where the Black Death announced itself not with battle or conquest, but with silence, silent ships, silent rats, silent fleas. Messina's tragedy was Europe's warning, though few yet understood it. The death ships had arrived, and with them, the medieval world began to die. When the people of Messina forced the death ships back to sea in the autumn of 1347, they thought they had rid themselves of the contagion. But by then, the plague had already crept ashore, and the ships themselves, drifting westward, carried their lethal cargo into new waters. One of their next destinations was Marseille, the bustling Provençal port that served as France's gateway to the Mediterranean. What arrived there was not commerce or camaraderie, but the silent messenger of death that had already begun its dreadful work in Sicily. Marseille in the 14th century was a city of contrasts. Merchants from the Levant, North Africa, and Italy crowded its quays. Warehouses overflowed with grain, olive oil, and wine. Pilgrims gathered there before sailing to the Holy Land, while knights and scholars passed through on their way to Avignon, where the papacy then resided. The harbor was a crossroads of the known world, a place where wealth and faith intersected. Yet that same openness made it vulnerable. When the ghostly ships arrived, their crews dead or dying, Marseille became the next spark in the widening conflagration. Chroniclers describe how the vessels sailed into the port with eerie quiet. The few men still alive were so disfigured by the swelling buboes and black blotches of the plague that they inspired more horror than pity. Attempts to quarantine them proved fruitless. The plague's true carriers, rats and their fleas, had already slipped ashore, scurrying into warehouses and alleys, mingling with local vermin. Soon, Marseille's streets echoed with the sound of wailing as the first citizens fell. Within weeks, the contagion swept across the city like fire through dry brush. The mortality was staggering. Entire households collapsed within days. Priests, overwhelmed by the demand for last rites, succumbed themselves, leaving the dying without spiritual comfort. The city's Jewish quarter, already subject to suspicion, became a target of rage. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells or conjured the disease with sorcery. Pogroms erupted, adding human violence to natural calamity. The plague killed indiscriminately, but fear sought scapegoats, and Marseille's Jews bore the brunt of that fury. Marseille's leaders tried measures that now seemed tragically inadequate. Some attempted isolation, closing city gates to travelers. Others ordered processions of penitents, with barefoot citizens marching through the streets, whipping themselves in desperate appeal to God. Merchants burned incense to purify the air. Physicians applied leeches and lanced buboes. None of it stemmed the tide. The dead outnumbered the living. Corpses piled in churches, and carts rumbled through the streets carrying bodies to mass graves. The city's rhythm of trade and prayer gave way to silence, broken only by the tolling of funeral bells. From Marseille, the plague radiated outward into Provence and beyond. Merchants and refugees carried it inland to Avignon, seat of the papal court. There, Pope Clement VI retreated into a chamber surrounded by constantly burning fires, believing the flames might purify the air. Even within those guarded walls, death struck cardinals, priests, and commoners alike. Chroniclers estimate that in Avignon, corpses floated down the Rhône in such numbers that bargemen refused to navigate the river. The wealthiest city in Christendom, seat of spiritual authority, could do nothing but watch as God's judgment, or what they believed to be judgment, ravaged it. The contagion also traveled north along trade routes, reaching Lyon and Paris, and westward into Spain through Catalonia. The death ships had unleashed not a local outbreak, but a continental inferno. Wherever ships docked, wherever merchants traveled, wherever pilgrims prayed, the plague followed. Marseille was the hinge point, the place where the Black Death leapt from Italy into France, Spain, and the wider European mainland. For the people of Marseille, the experience was apocalyptic. To their eyes, the ships were cursed, the disease a punishment from heaven. Astrologers claimed the stars had aligned in malign conjunction. priests preached that human sin had provoked God's wrath. Others whispered of conspiracies, of poisons spread by outsiders, of malevolent witches. Rational explanation was impossible. Only divine or diabolical power could account for such devastation. In their desperation, some fled to the countryside, unknowingly carrying the disease further. Others locked themselves in homes, hoarding food and abandoning neighbors. The plague eroded not only bodies but the very bonds of community. Modern science reveals the true mechanism. Fleas carried Yersinia pestis, transmitting it from rats to humans, and in turn from humans to humans through pneumonic infection. Yet even with that knowledge, the terror of those who lived through it is comprehensible. Imagine a city where within a month, half the population lies dead, where bells toll without cease, where the smell of decay fills the air, and where every cough is a death sentence. To the people of 1347 Marseille, it was the end of the world. The symbolism of Marseille's outbreak lies in its role as conduit. The death ships were not confined to one port. They were part of a chain reaction across the Mediterranean. From Caffa to Messina to Marseille, each harbor became another link in a widening circle of doom. Marseille was not simply a victim, but a multiplier, its networks of trade and pilgrimage carrying the plague deeper into Europe. In its crowded streets, one sees the pattern of the 14th century itself, interconnected, thriving, yet utterly vulnerable to forces it could not comprehend. Thus, Chapter 4 traces the fire's spread from Sicily to France, showing how the death ships turned one city's tragedy into a continent's catastrophe. Marseille's wealth could not save it. Its prayers could not shield it. Its science could not explain it. The plague was merciless, and the ships that carried it were unstoppable. In Marseille, the Black Death ceased to be a Sicilian nightmare and became Europe's disaster. By the winter of 1347, the death ships that had drifted from Caffa through Messina and Marseille continued their fatal voyage, carried along the currents of trade and desperation. Their sails, once symbols of prosperity, now heralded ruin. Next in line were the great maritime republics of Genoa and Venice, the twin jewels of Italy's seaborne commerce. These were cities that had built their fortunes on the sea, whose fleets stretched from the Levant to Flanders, whose merchant princes ruled with wealth as powerful as any king's army. But the very arteries of trade that made them rich also made them vulnerable, for the death ships were not bound by walls or armies. They arrived silently, and when they did, commerce became catastrophe. Genoa, whose merchants had first fled Caffa, was among the earliest to feel the plague's sting. Ships returning from the Black Sea carried not only silks and spices, but fleas and rats, the invisible couriers of pestilence. When the vessels docked, Genoese citizens recoiled from the sight of crews already dying, their bodies marked with the black buboes of plague. Attempts were made to turn the ships away, but as in Messina and Marseille, it was too late. The contagion had already stepped ashore, gnawing its way into the crowded alleys and bustling markets of the city. The impact was swift and brutal. Genoa, with its steep streets and densely packed quarters, provided the perfect breeding ground for the plague. Families were cut down in days, leaving homes abandoned, their doors nailed shut with corpses still inside. Merchants who had once commanded caravans and fleets collapsed in their counting houses, their ledgers unfinished. Sailors who had braved storms and pirates died gasping in the harborside taverns. The city that had once embodied wealth and vigor now groaned with the stench of mass graves. But the disaster did not end at Genoa's walls. The Genoese, panicked and desperate to escape, fled by ship to other ports. In doing so, they spread the plague further, carrying it to Corsica, Sardinia, and eventually as far as Spain. Chroniclers later condemned them for this, calling them the Sours of Death, accusing them of unleashing pestilence upon every harbor they touched. Yet for the Genoese, it was survival. They fled not out of malice, but out of terror. Their flight, however, ensured that the death ships multiplied, each vessel a coffin sailing under the Mediterranean sun. If Genoa's fall was tragic, Venice's was apocalyptic. The Serenissima, the most serene republic, was at the height of its power in the mid-14th century. Its ships commanded the Adriatic. Its merchants filled the Rialto with goods from Alexandria, Constantinople, and beyond. The city was a marvel of canals and palaces, its wealth dazzling, its influence unrivaled. Yet when the plague ships arrived in early 1348, all that magnificence proved fragile. The arrival of plague in Venice is recorded with chilling clarity by contemporary observers. The city's lagoons, once filled with the laughter of gondoliers and the cries of traders, fell silent as bodies piled on quays and in palaces. The disease spread with astonishing speed, carried by rats through warehouses and by human breath through narrow alleys. Venice's density, its very vitality, became its doom. Chroniclers estimated that within months, more than half the city's population lay dead. Entire neighborhoods emptied, their canals choked with unattended boats, their palaces shuttered, their churches filled with corpses. The Venetian government, famed for its organization, attempted to respond. Even the wealthiest patrician families, who fled to villas on the mainland, found no refuge. The disease followed them inland. Priests died at altars, physicians perished beside patients, and the Doge himself was said to have feared the end of the Republic. Venice, which had prided itself on serene order, was thrown into chaos. For both Genoa and Venice, the plague was more than mortality, it was humiliation. These were cities that had dominated Mediterranean trade, projecting power across seas and continents. Their fleets had brought wealth beyond imagining. Their merchants had stood equal to kings. Yet a handful of vermin, unseen and unheralded, humbled them utterly. The plague revealed the vulnerability of even the greatest republics, the futility of walls and wealth against an enemy too small to see. The social fabric unraveled. In Genoa, survivors accused foreigners and Jews of spreading the disease, leading to pogroms and expulsions. In Venice, some turned to flagellation, marching through the streets whipping themselves to atone for imagined sins. Others sought pleasure in desperation, indulging in feasts and orgies, believing death imminent and inevitable. Trust in institutions faltered, faith in God wavered. For many, the death ships proved not only the fragility of life, but the fragility of belief. Yet, even amid the devastation, the spirit of commerce persisted. In Venice, merchants continued to conduct business, sometimes from plague-ridden houses, unwilling to let go of profit even as death stalked them. In Genoa, ships still sailed, their holds filled with goods and with plague. The paradox of the republics was stark. Trade was both their strength and their undoing. They could not stop, for commerce was life itself. And so long as they traded, they carried death. The symbolism of Genoa and Venice in the saga of the death ships is profound. These were not minor ports, but the mightiest maritime republics of medieval Europe, embodiments of wealth, power, and connection. Their devastation proved that no city, however rich, was immune. The plague was the great leveler, striking noble and peasant, merchant and sailor, priest and prostitute alike. In Genoa and Venice, the death ships showed their full power, not just to kill, but to humble the proudest of cities. Thus, Chapter 5 reveals how commerce became catastrophe, how the very networks that enriched Europe also doomed it. The ships that once carried spices now carried fleas, the galleys that once bore silks now bore corpses. Venice and Genoa, pillars of medieval trade, were reduced to charnel houses, their canals and alleys filled with silence and sorrow. The death ships had found their greatest victims, and through them, the plague spread further still, tightening its grip on Europe. By the early months of 1348, the death ships that had drifted from Messina to Marseille and into the harbors of Genoa and Venice had accomplished what no army or crusade ever had. They carried doom to the very heart of Christendom. From Marseille, the plague traveled up the Rhone River, borne by merchants and refugees, until it reached Avignon, the seat of the papacy, where Pope Clement VI presided over what many called the Babylonian captivity of the Church. If the holy city of Rome had been stripped of papal authority, Avignon had become its substitute, a place of clerical grandeur, bustling commerce, and immense symbolic weight. When the plague entered its gates, it was not just a city that suffered, but the very image of Christendom itself. Avignon was, in many ways, an ideal incubator for the disease. The city's population had swollen in the 14th century, as the papal court attracted not only clerics but bankers, artisans, scholars, and pilgrims. Its narrow streets teemed with merchants from across Europe, its inns and taverns brimming with travelers. Grain shipments poured in from the surrounding countryside, stored in vast warehouses whose shadows were perfect havens for rats. When the first cases appeared in early 1348, the plague spread with explosive speed. Chroniclers describe scenes of overwhelming horror. Within days of the first deaths, whole households collapsed. Priests were summoned to administer last rites, but often died themselves before the words were finished. The Rhone River, flowing through the city, soon bore witness to an unprecedented sight. So many corpses piled up that they were cast directly into the water. One observer wrote that barges refused to sail, the stench of bodies fouling the very current. In a city that was supposed to embody divine order, chaos reigned. The papal court was not spared. Cardinals and clerks perished, leaving their offices vacant. The machinery of the church faltered as bishops and priests died faster than replacements could be ordained. Rumors spread that even the Pope himself would succumb. Pope Clement VI, desperate to survive, withdrew into isolation. Chronicles record that he confined himself within chambers where great fires were kept burning day and night, believing the flames would purify the air of contagion. He avoided contact with all but a few attendants, holding audiences from a distance. His authority diminished to little more than the flicker of firelight. Yet Clement VI did not abandon his role entirely. He issued bulls granting absolution to all who died of the plague, recognizing that priests were too few to administer last rites to the countless dying. He consecrated the Rhone River itself as holy ground, so that those whose bodies were thrown into it would still receive sacred burial. In these gestures, small but significant, the papacy acknowledged both the scale of the crisis and the limits of human power. Avignon's suffering was proof that no city, no priest, no pope was immune. The people of Avignon, like those of Messina and Marseille, sought explanations. Some turned to astrology, claiming that a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 had poisoned the air. Others blamed foreigners, Jews, or lepers, leading to waves of violence and persecution. Flagellants paraded through the streets, whipping themselves bloody in the belief that their penance might appease God's wrath. Others surrendered to despair, feasting and drinking in the shadow of death, convinced that each day might be their last. Avignon, which had once been a center of clerical order, became a theater of chaos where faith clashed with fear. The mortality was staggering. Some estimates suggest that as many as 2/3 of the city's inhabitants perished within months. Monasteries were emptied, their chants silenced. Markets stood deserted, their goods rotting in the sun. Bells tolled endlessly, until the bell ringers themselves fell silent. The papal palace, which had symbolized the grandeur of the Avignon papacy, stood amid a city transformed into a charnel house. And yet, even amid the devastation, Avignon's significance amplified the plague's psychological impact. If God's chosen city could not be spared, what hope had others? The death ships that had drifted into Marseille had now unleashed a contagion that reached the highest seat of Christendom. The plague was no longer a Sicilian or Provençal tragedy. It was a universal catastrophe, striking at the very heart of Europe's faith and authority. The symbolism of Avignon's suffering reverberated across the continent. It confirmed for many that the plague was divine punishment, that no walls, wealth, or prayers could halt God's wrath. It also exposed the Church's fragility. If the Pope himself had to cower behind walls of fire, if cardinals died in droves, then what power did the Church truly wield against such forces? Faith endured, but trust in clerical authority faltered. Seeds of doubt, which centuries later would flower into reform, found early nourishment in the shadow of the plague. From Avignon, the plague spread further still. Merchants carried it north into Lyon and Paris, westward into Gascony and the Iberian Peninsula, eastward into Switzerland and Germany. The Rhone River, once lifeline of commerce, became the artery of death. Wherever ships sailed, wherever refugees fled, the disease followed, carried in the fur of rats and the breath of the dying. Thus, Chapter 6 reveals the plague's arrival not just in any city, but in Christendom's symbolic heart. The death ships had now transformed maritime tragedy into continental apocalypse. Avignon, with its papal palace and sacred aura, was reduced to silence and ash. The Black Death was no longer rumor or regional affliction. It was universal judgment, spreading outward in waves that would consume all of Europe. By the spring of 1348, the plague that had entered Europe through the silent drift of death ships into Messina, Marseille, Genoa, and Venice had advanced inland like an unrelenting tide. Its next great victim was Paris, the heart of the French kingdom, a city whose power and prestige had long dominated Europe. If Avignon had shown that the papacy was vulnerable, Paris revealed that even the greatest capitals could not withstand the invisible hand of pestilence. In the streets of Paris, the Black Death became not just a calamity of bodies, but a calamity of nations. Paris in the mid-14th century was the largest city in Western Europe, with perhaps 200,000 souls. It was a place of grandeur and squalor in equal measure. The majesty of Notre Dame and the Louvre Castle rising above labyrinthine alleys where butchers, artisans, and beggars lived side by side. The University of Paris drew scholars from across Christendom, while markets and fairs made it a hub of commerce. But its very density, its vibrancy, made it perilously susceptible to contagion. When the plague arrived in 1348, borne by traders and refugees along the Rhône and Saône rivers and overland routes from Avignon, it found a city primed for devastation. The first signs appeared quietly: merchants struck down, students collapsing in their dormitories, peasants dying on the roads leading into the city. Soon, the symptoms became unmistakable: the swollen buboes in the groin and armpits, the black blotches upon the skin, the bloody coughing fits that heralded pneumonic infection. Paris, like Messina and Marseille before it, descended into chaos. The bells of Notre Dame tolled endlessly, funeral chants echoed across the Seine, and yet there were not enough priests to anoint the dying nor enough gravediggers to bury them. Bodies piled in streets until carts carried them to pits dug in haste beyond the city walls. The monarchy itself could not escape the shadow of the plague. King Philip VI, who had recently launched France into the 100 Years' War with England, withdrew into isolation, fearing contagion. His court scattered, courtiers retreating to rural estates, leaving the machinery of governance weakened. Chroniclers speak of nobles fleeing as readily as commoners, abandoning their responsibilities to preserve their lives. The king's authority, already strained by war and taxation, faltered further under the weight of disease. Paris, the crown's jewel, was reduced to a city of terror and despair. Amid the chaos, attempts were made to find explanations. The learned faculty of the University of Paris, commissioned by Philip VI himself, produced a report attributing the plague to astrological causes. A conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 had poisoned the air, they declared, and miasmas rising from the earth now spread it. This theory gave the appearance of rationality, yet offered no remedy. Meanwhile, the populace turned to more immediate scapegoats. Jews were accused of poisoning wells, leading to waves of persecution and pogroms. In Paris and beyond, communities were massacred, their deaths adding human cruelty to nature's horror. Faith also fractured under the strain. Some turned to the church with greater fervor, joining processions, praying for deliverance, and participating in flagellant movements that marched through the streets, whipping themselves in penitence. Others abandoned faith altogether, seeing in the plague proof that God had abandoned them. Priests and monks died in vast numbers, their absence leaving many to perish without sacraments. The spiritual crisis ran as deep as the demographic one, shaking the foundations of medieval piety. The sheer scale of death in Paris stunned contemporaries. Chroniclers estimated that tens of thousands perished within months. Cemeteries overflowed. New burial grounds were consecrated hastily. The famous cemetery of Les Innocents filled so rapidly that bodies were stacked in charnel houses, their bones left exposed. The smell of death pervaded the air, so strong that physicians carried pomanders of herbs and spices to ward off the stench. Yet no incense, no charm, no prayer could halt the tide. The plague also reshaped the social fabric of the city. With so many dead, labor became scarce, wages rose, and survivors demanded better conditions. Traditional hierarchies wavered as the poor gained bargaining power, and resentment simmered among nobles and guilds. Women, often left widowed, took new roles as heads of households, altering gender dynamics. Orphans roamed the streets, testaments to families erased in a single week. In the alleys of Paris, one could see not only death but the faint outlines of a new social order struggling to emerge from the ruins. The cultural impact was profound. Writers and poets grappled with the enormity of the disaster. Jean de Venette, a Parisian chronicler, recorded the plague with both horror and empathy, describing how mothers abandoned children, priests abandoned flocks, and yet some remained steadfast, caring for the sick at the cost of their own lives. His words echo across centuries, reminding us that even in apocalypse, human compassion endured. At the same time, art and literature began to reflect a darker tone. Images of the danse macabre, the dance of death, emerged as metaphors for the universality of mortality. Paris, the intellectual heart of Europe, became a crucible for cultural transformations that would shape the late Middle Ages. Yet above all, Paris symbolized the universality of the Black Death. If the Pope in Avignon and the King in Paris could not protect their people, if priests and physicians alike fell to the same fate as beggars and peasants, then no one was safe. The plague was the great equalizer, dissolving the boundaries of rank and wealth. The death ships had carried more than a bacterium. They had carried a lesson in human fragility, a reminder that empires and capitals were as mortal as the humblest fishermen. By the summer of 1348, Paris lay shattered. Its streets were quieter, its population halved, its faith shaken, its crown weakened. Yet from Paris, the plague spread still further, carried northward into Flanders and England, eastward into Germany and Bohemia. The Seine had become another artery of contagion, linking the death ship's maritime origins with the heart of continental Europe. Thus, Chapter 7 shows how the Black Death, born from ships drifting silently into Mediterranean harbors, now reached the very core of France. In Paris, the plague was not merely a medical or demographic event. It was a political, social, and cultural earthquake. The city that had crowned kings, produced scholars, and defined faith was reduced to a necropolis. And from its ruins, the death ship's legacy spread wider still, leaving no corner of Europe untouched. By the late summer of 1348, the tide of plague that had swept from Messina to Marseille, through Genoa, Venice, Avignon, and Paris, reached the northern shores of France. From there, it was only a short passage across the English Channel before the pestilence struck England, a kingdom already strained by famine, social unrest, and the opening decades of the Hundred Years' War. The arrival of the Black Death on English soil was not the result of invading armies or diplomatic intrigues, but of the same silent couriers that had haunted Mediterranean ports, ships carrying rats, fleas, and the invisible hand of death. The first confirmed landing point was the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, now part of Weymouth, in June 1348. Chroniclers note that a vessel, possibly from Gascony, arrived with sailors already sickened. Within days, the town's inhabitants were dying in droves. The disease then spread inland along trade and pilgrimage routes, creeping towards Salisbury, Bristol, and London. By autumn, England was firmly in the grip of the plague. England's vulnerability lay in its networks. Its ports connected it to France and Flanders. Its markets attracted merchants from across Europe, and its roads carried goods and people through towns and villages. What had been lifelines of prosperity became conduits of pestilence. Bristol, a thriving trading hub, was devastated. Contemporary accounts described corpses piled in carts, the streets emptied of all but the dead. Gloucester, once a lively center, became so ravaged that chroniclers claimed no one was left alive to bury the dead. From there, the plague crept inexorably toward London, the beating heart of the kingdom. London in 1348 was a crowded, bustling metropolis of perhaps 80,000 souls. Its narrow lanes, open sewers, and crowded markets made it fertile ground for contagion. When the plague arrived in late autumn, it spread with terrifying rapidity. Chroniclers described the city as overwhelmed by death. Churches filled with corpses, grave diggers collapsing from exhaustion, and cemeteries overflowing. New burial grounds had to be consecrated outside the city walls, the most famous being the plague pits at East Smithfield, where thousands of bodies were interred in vast communal graves. The bells of St. Paul's tolled ceaselessly. The city transformed into a theater of mourning. The social order faltered. With death omnipresent, law and governance broke down. Officials fled, physicians refused to treat patients, and clergy often abandoned their parishes. Yet amid the collapse, stories of courage also emerged. Some priests, knowing the risk, continued to administer last rites, dying as martyrs of compassion. Neighbors risked contagion to care for the sick, leaving rare but enduring examples of solidarity in a sea of fear. King Edward III and his court retreated to the countryside, seeking refuge from the contagion. But even royal isolation proved fragile. In 1349, Edward's beloved daughter, Joan, died of the plague while en route to marry the son of the King of Castile. Her death struck the monarchy with brutal intimacy, showing that no wealth or lineage could shield one from the Black Death. England's ruling class, like its peasants, faced the same indiscriminate mortality. The demographic impact was staggering. Estimates suggest that between one-third and one-half of England's population perished between 1348 and 1350. Villages vanished from maps, their fields left untended. Labor shortages transformed the economy. Survivors, suddenly in demand, demanded higher wages, undermining the rigid feudal order. The Statute of Laborers, issued in 1351, sought to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but enforcement proved impossible. The seeds of social change were planted in the plague's ashes, foreshadowing uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Culturally, the plague left deep scars. The poetry of the time turned morbid, reflecting on death's universality. Images of the danse macabre, the dance of death uniting king and peasant alike, spread through art. Writers like William Langland later echoed the trauma, portraying a society unsettled by loss. Religious doubt grew, as people questioned why a just God had allowed such suffering. Some turned to fanaticism, others to cynicism, others still to quiet devotion. The Black Death did not end faith in England, but it transformed it, making it more personal, more fearful, more attuned to death's shadow. The symbolism of England's experience is poignant. The kingdom had once believed itself insulated by the Channel, protected by geography as much as by armies. Yet the death ships needed no armies. They came silently, borne by trade and tide, carrying no banners, demanding no tribute. England, like Sicily and France before it, discovered that in the face of plague, no island was safe, no king secure, no city impregnable. The Black Death dissolved boundaries, uniting Europe not in prosperity or faith, but in mortality. By 1350, the pestilence had swept across England, leaving devastation in its wake. Fields lay fallow, churches emptied, cities half deserted. Yet survivors endured, reshaping their world in the absence of those lost. The death ships that had first drifted into Messina had now reached the farthest shores of the British Isles, their grim legacy written in graves across the land. Thus, Chapter 8 shows how the Black Death leapt across the Channel, transforming England forever. It was not only a demographic disaster, but a catalyst for economic, social, and cultural change. The death ships had brought more than disease. They had brought revolution, tearing down the old order and forcing survivors to build anew. By 1349, the Black Death had burned through southern and western Europe with a fury unmatched in living memory. From the death ships at Messina to the plague pits of London, it seemed no land was beyond the reach of the invisible enemy. Yet even as England staggered under the weight of corpses, the plague pressed farther north, carried across cold seas and fjords into the kingdoms of Scandinavia. The story of its arrival in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden reveals once more the eerie role of drifting ships. Vessels that had once been engines of trade becoming floating coffins, their silence more dreadful than the clash of any fleet. The most chilling tale comes from Norway. In the autumn of 1349, a ship from England, accounts vary whether from London or from the western port of Bristol, sailed for Bergen, Norway's great Hanseatic trading hub. When the vessel drifted into the harbor, its sails slack, its decks unervingly quiet, those who approached found a scene almost identical to Messina 2 years earlier. The crew lay dead, blackened and bloated, stricken by plague mid-voyage. Some versions of the story claim no living soul remained to moor the ship. It drifted in on tide and wind alone, death its only cargo. The rats in its hold disembarked eagerly, carrying fleas that leapt into the town's warehouses and taverns. Bergen, unsuspecting and unprepared, became the first Norwegian victim. From Bergen, the plague radiated outward along the fjords and mountain passes. Norway's scattered settlements, tied together by maritime routes, proved helpless against the contagion. Villages vanished, farms lay abandoned, churches stood empty as priests died. Chroniclers estimate that in some regions, half the population perished. Entire valleys were depopulated, leaving ruins that nature reclaimed. Even in Norway's rugged isolation, the plague proved merciless. Geography offered no defense against vermin and breath. Denmark's encounter was no less grim. In 1349 and 1350, the disease swept across Jutland and the islands, carried by traders and fishermen. Copenhagen and other towns saw the same horrors as London and Paris. Carts laden with bodies, churches overwhelmed, families extinguished in days. Chroniclers speak of noble estates collapsing as lords and peasants alike succumbed. Denmark's monarchy, already weak from internal strife, faltered further under the weight of depopulation. The labor shortages that reshaped England also reshaped Denmark, altering landholding patterns and weakening the grip of aristocracy. Sweden, reached slightly later, endured devastation on a similar scale. The plague is believed to have entered through coastal towns like Visby on the island of Gotland, a vital hub in the Hanseatic trade network. Merchant ships, laden with grain and cloth, also carried fleas and rats. Visby, famed for its walls and churches, became a charnel house, its markets silent, its streets littered with the dead. From there, the disease spread into mainland Sweden, leaving no province untouched. Chroniclers speak of villages so emptied that wolves prowled streets once filled with children. In Uppsala and Stockholm, the heart of Swedish authority, the plague decimated clergy, nobility, and commoners alike. The Scandinavian experience underscores the chilling motif of the death ships. In southern Europe, the vessels had carried plague from port to port as part of bustling trade. In the north, where distances were longer and settlements sparser, the ships sometimes arrived not as merchantmen but as spectral drifters, crews dead, hulls silent, cargoes untouched. The very image of a ship arriving without sailors, sails slack and ropes trailing, must have seemed like a visitation from the underworld. To the medieval imagination, these vessels were not simply plague-bearers but omens, physical embodiments of divine wrath. The psychological impact was profound. Scandinavia's people, already living in harsh conditions of cold and scarcity, interpreted the plague as apocalyptic. Priests preached that it was punishment for sin, while common folk whispered of trolls and spirits spreading disease. In Norway, sagas and folklore absorbed the plague into their narratives, blending memory with myth. Songs spoke of ghost ships gliding along fjords, their decks crowded not with sailors but with the restless dead. Such tales ensured that the memory of the death ships lingered long after the epidemic passed. Demographically, the losses were catastrophic. Some historians estimate that Norway lost as much as 60% of its population. The consequences were long-lasting. Farms lay empty for generations, and the country's political strength weakened, paving the way for its later union with Denmark. Sweden and Denmark, while less depopulated, also suffered immense losses, their economies destabilized, their aristocracies shaken. Scandinavia, once peripheral to European politics, found itself transformed by the same catastrophe that consumed the continent's core. The symbolism of the Scandinavian outbreaks lies in their finality. The plague had leapt from Asia into Crimea, from Crimea into Sicily, from Sicily across Europe, and now it had reached the cold northern seas. No land was too distant, no shore too remote. The death ships, whether guided by dying sailors or by tide alone, had carried the Black Death to the edges of Europe. The continent itself seemed consumed, from the Mediterranean to the Arctic. Yet the northern experience also demonstrates resilience. Survivors adapted, reclaiming abandoned lands, reshaping economies, and redefining communities. The depopulation allowed peasants greater leverage, loosening feudal bonds. The church, though weakened, continued to serve as anchor for faith. Out of devastation, a new social order slowly emerged. But the memory of how the plague arrived, on ships of silence and corpses, remained etched into collective memory, a reminder of how fragile civilization can be when faced with forces beyond its control. Thus, Chapter 9 shows how the plague crossed the seas into Scandinavia, carried once more by ships that were less vessels of commerce than floating graves. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden suffered losses as devastating as those of southern Europe, proving that no corner of the continent was immune. The death ships had finished their work. From Sicily to the northern fjords, they had delivered death to every harbor they touched. By 1348, as death ships haunted the Mediterranean and North Sea alike, the Black Death surged eastward into the sprawling expanse of the Holy Roman Empire. From the Rhineland to Bavaria, from the Hanseatic ports of the Baltic to the Alpine valleys, the empire was a patchwork of bishoprics, free cities, duchies, and principalities, each with its own laws, armies, and customs, but all connected by trade routes that now served as the plague's arteries. What had begun on drifting ships in Messina had become a continental deluge, and in the German lands it unleashed not only disease but social upheaval, violence, and deep spiritual crisis. The first signs appeared in the Rhineland, carried up the rivers from France and Switzerland. Cologne, Mainz, and Strasbourg soon reported outbreaks. The disease followed the Rhine's current like an invisible invader, moving from town to town with terrifying speed. Merchants who had once brought prosperity now carried contagion. Barges that had once transported wine and cloth now bore death. Cities that had long prided themselves on independence and prosperity suddenly found themselves helpless before a foe no charter or militia could resist. As in Paris and London, the symptoms were unmistakable. Buboes swelled in armpits and groins, fevers burned, and death came swiftly. Entire households perished within days. Chroniclers wrote of streets lined with corpses, of churches overwhelmed, of fields left untilled. Yet in the empire, the social fabric unraveled in ways that were especially violent. Fear demanded explanations, and in the absence of science, scapegoats were found. The Jewish communities of the Rhineland bore the brunt of this fury. Already marginalized by restrictive laws, they were accused of poisoning wells, of conspiring to spread the disease, of summoning demons to destroy Christendom. Rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by desperation. In city after city, pogroms erupted. In Strasbourg in 1349, one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe was annihilated. Thousands were rounded up, herded into a wooden structure, and burned alive, while others were massacred in the streets. Chroniclers recorded the horror with chilling detachment, some condemning it, others justifying it as divine will. The plague had already killed indiscriminately, but fear turned men into executioners, compounding the tragedy with cruelty. The economic impact was immense. The German lands had thrived on trade, with Hanseatic merchants dominating Baltic commerce and Rhine cities prospering from river traffic. But as mortality soared, labor shortages crippled agriculture and industry. Survivors demanded higher wages, threatening the privileges of guilds and nobles. Fields lay fallow, harvests failed, and famine loomed. In some towns, desperate measures were taken. Debts were canceled, rents reduced, laws rewritten to retain peasants on the land. The empire's intricate feudal web strained under the pressure, threads snapping one after another. Religious responses varied. Some clergy, as elsewhere, bravely ministered to the dying and perished in vast numbers. Others fled, abandoning parishes and monasteries. Flagellant movements arose with particular intensity in the German lands. Bands of penitents, sometimes numbering hundreds, marched barefoot from town to town, whipping themselves bloody as they chanted hymns of repentance. They believed their suffering would appease God's wrath and halt the plague. Crowds gathered to watch, to weep, and sometimes to join. Authorities at first tolerated them, but as the flagellants grew more radical, denouncing priests, spreading panic, and inciting violence against Jews, the papacy eventually condemned the movement. Yet their processions left a mark on the German imagination, an image of desperate piety in the face of incomprehensible disaster. Politically, the empire wavered. Emperor Charles IV, already more a figurehead than a true sovereign in the fragmented realm, could do little. Local rulers made their own responses. Some imposed quarantines, others expelled foreigners, others organized mass prayers. Yet none of it availed. The decentralized structure of the Holy Roman Empire, usually a source of resilience, now proved a weakness. Without unity, towns and villages faced the plague alone, their responses inconsistent and often counterproductive. Culturally, the plague's devastation found echoes in German art and literature. Songs and poems lamented the universality of death. Chronicles described not only horror but resignation, as if the empire itself had entered its twilight. In some cities, murals of the Todentans, the dance of death, appeared, depicting skeletons leading nobles, merchants, peasants, and clergy in a grim procession. These images captured the central truth of the Black Death. Mortality was universal, no rank immune, no wealth sufficient. In the empire's cathedrals and churches, the great stone vaults became resonant with both prayer and despair, reminders that even the strongest walls could not bar death. The demographic toll mirrored that of Western Europe. In some regions, as much as half the population perished. Villages vanished from maps, castles fell into disrepair, monasteries emptied. In rural areas, wolves prowled abandoned fields, a haunting symbol of nature reclaiming human spaces. The losses altered the trajectory of the empire. Labor shortages shifted power from nobles to peasants. Trade networks contracted, and cities struggled to recover. The plague did not destroy the Holy Roman Empire, but it transformed it, leaving scars that endured for centuries. The symbolism of the German experience lies in its extremes. The Black Death was already a catastrophe of biology, but in the empire it became a catastrophe of human cruelty as well. Pogroms, flagellants, and persecution revealed how fear corrodes compassion, how quickly communities fracture under pressure. The death ships had delivered more than disease. They had delivered a mirror in which Europe saw its own darkest impulses reflected. By 1350, the plague had swept through much of the German lands, leaving devastation in its wake. The empire endured, but it was diminished, its population halved, its economy shaken, its faith fractured. Yet survivors rebuilt, replanting fields, reopening markets, reweaving the torn fabric of community. From the ashes of death, new societies would slowly emerge. Thus, Chapter 10 shows how the death ship's legacy reverberated in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. Disease humbled cities, fear bred violence, faith spawned fanaticism. The empire that had withstood centuries of wars and invasions found itself powerless before vermin and breath. The Black Death was not just a biological event. It was a crucible that revealed the fragility of order and the endurance of fear. By 1349 and 1350, much of Western Europe lay under the shadow of the Black Death. From the drifting death ships of Messina to the plague pits of Paris, London, and the Rhineland, tens of millions had perished. Yet the plague did not halt at the Alps or the Rhine. It pressed eastward, carried by traders, armies, and pilgrims into Central and Eastern Europe. Here, too, the story unfolded with eerie variations. Some kingdoms ravaged beyond recognition, others seemingly spared, their survival weaving legends of divine protection. Hungary was among the first Eastern realms to feel the plague's grip. Its fertile plains, threaded with trade routes linking the Adriatic, the Balkans, and the Danube basin, provided a corridor for contagion. Merchants from Italy and Austria carried more than cloth and wine into Buda, the royal seat of King Louis I. They carried the unseen plague fleas that thrived in their cargo. Chronicles describe how the disease struck suddenly, cutting down nobles and peasants alike. Buda's royal court, like those of Paris and London, scattered in fear. King Louis himself survived, but his realm was scarred. Entire villages along the Danube were emptied, monasteries fell silent, and Hungary's population may have been reduced by as much as one-third. The kingdom survived, but its resilience was tested in ways that would echo through later centuries. Farther north, Bohemia also reeled under the pestilence. Prague, vibrant with merchants and scholars, succumbed in 1349. Its narrow streets and crowded markets became scenes of despair familiar to Paris and Cologne. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, who had made Prague his seat, fled the city, seeking safety in the countryside. He would later return to rebuild and fortify his capital, but the memory of those months of horror would linger in the empire's eastern heart. Yet perhaps the most remarkable story of the plague's eastward march concerns Poland. Chroniclers note with astonishment that while Germany and Bohemia suffered immense mortality, Poland was struck comparatively lightly. Cities like Krakow and Gdansk did see outbreaks, but the devastation was not on the same catastrophic scale as elsewhere. Some attributed this to Poland's relative isolation, fewer commercial arteries tying it directly to infected regions. Others pointed to geography, suggesting that the Carpathian Mountains and sparsely populated plains slowed the spread. Still others, steeped in medieval religiosity, declared that divine providence had spared Poland, rewarding its piety and King Casimir III's just rule. Legends grew. In later centuries, Poles would repeat stories of miraculous protection, of prayers answered and saints interceding. Historians, more cautious, suggest practical reasons. Poland's towns were smaller, its roads less trafficked, its connections to Mediterranean trade weaker. Rats and fleas traveled best in dense networks. Where the networks thinned, so too did the contagion. Yet to contemporaries, Poland's relative survival seemed nothing less than a miracle. In a Europe convinced that God was punishing sin, the sparing of Poland was interpreted as divine favor, reinforcing faith even as elsewhere it faltered. Further east, the story darkens again. In the Balkans, the plague followed Venetian and Genoese merchants into Dalmatian ports. Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, a thriving maritime republic, suffered immensely. It was here, ironically, that one of history's earliest quarantine practices emerged. Ships suspected of carrying plague were required to wait in isolation outside the harbor for 30 days, later extended to 40, hence quarantina. Though imperfect, this measure reflected the desperate ingenuity of survivors, groping toward public health centuries before the word existed. In Russia, the story remains hazier, but chronicles suggest that the pestilence spread from the south, carried along steppe routes from the Black Sea. Novgorod and Pskov, trading hubs of the Hanseatic League, suffered grievously. The Orthodox clergy, like their Latin counterparts, interpreted the plague as divine wrath. Monasteries prayed and fasted, yet many succumbed. In the forests and villages of Russia, the plague became fused with folklore, remembered as an invisible rider sweeping across fields, leaving silence where once there had been life. The eastward march of the Black Death reveals not uniform devastation, but a patchwork of outcomes. Some lands, like Hungary and Bohemia, endured suffering as great as France or Italy. Others, like Poland, were spared the worst, whether through chance, geography, or miracle. This unevenness shaped memory. Where mortality was high, despair and violence flourished. Pogroms, flagellants, collapse of order. Where mortality was lighter, resilience and even pride emerged, reinforcing cultural narratives of chosenness and divine protection. Yet even in spared lands, the plague's shadow fell. Trade contracted, fear spread, refugees carried stories of ghost ships and empty cities. No kingdom could believe itself untouched when so much of Europe lay in ruins. The very idea of the death ships, the silent vessels drifting into harbor with corpses aboard, became a pan-European image, seared into imagination regardless of whether one had seen them with one's own eyes. The eastward spread also underscores the plague's global nature. From its Asian origins to Crimea, from Crimea to Sicily, from Sicily to Scandinavia and Russia, it traversed continents. It was not merely a European tragedy, but a Eurasian one, binding distant peoples in shared mortality. The death ships were only one part of a larger story, but they captured the essence. The world was interconnected, and with connection came vulnerability. Thus, Chapter 11 reveals how the Black Death advanced into Central and Eastern Europe, sparing some, devastating others. Hungary mourned its villages, Bohemia its capital, Russia its trade cities. Poland, relatively spared, wove survival into legend. And through it all, the plague's eastward march confirmed that no border, no wall, no crown could halt its spread. The death ships had begun the work, But land routes carried it further still, until Europe entire trembled under the weight of mortality. The death ships had brought more than plague to Europe, they had brought a crisis of faith. As the Black Death scythed through towns and villages, killing priests and peasants alike, the spiritual foundations of medieval Christendom cracked. The Church, long the bedrock of life, seemed powerless. Prayers did not halt the disease, relics did not protect the faithful, indulgences did not secure salvation from sudden death. In the wake of ghostly ships drifting into harbors, the medieval world's greatest institution faced its gravest test. At first, many turned to the Church with desperate devotion. Processions wound through city streets, with barefoot penitents carrying relics and chanting hymns. Monks and nuns prayed without ceasing, begging divine mercy. Pope Clement VI in Avignon consecrated the Rhone so the dead cast into its waters would receive holy burial, and he granted blanket absolution to plague victims who could not receive last rites. Priests risked their lives ministering to the sick, and many perished, their devotion remembered as martyrdom. Yet even this selflessness could not fill the void. In many parishes, the clergy died faster than replacements could be ordained. Villages went without sacraments. The dying went without comfort. For ordinary people, this absence of spiritual guardians deepened despair. The randomness of death gnawed at the medieval mind. Why did the pious nun die while the drunkard survived? Why did the innocent child perish while the corrupt noble endured? Traditional explanations, that sin brought suffering, that God punished wickedness, rang hollow when entire monasteries devoted to prayer were extinguished in days. In this gap, new and radical responses emerged. One of the most dramatic was the rise of the flagellants. These movements, strongest in the German lands, saw bands of men marching from town to town, barebacked, whipping themselves until blood flowed. They believed their suffering could atone for humanity's sins and end the plague. To terrified onlookers, the sight was both horrifying and compelling. Crowds wept, prayed, and sometimes joined. The flagellants rejected papal authority, declaring that only their penance could appease God's wrath. At first tolerated, they grew disruptive, inciting violence against Jews and undermining church control. By 1349, Pope Clement VI condemned them, but their marches left a lasting impression, an image of faith driven to extremes, of bodies made altars of desperation. Anti-Jewish violence, too, was fueled by religious fear. As the plague raged, Jews were accused of poisoning wells or consorting with the devil. Pogroms erupted across Europe, in Strasbourg, Basel, Mainz, and beyond, where entire communities were slaughtered, often with clerical blessing or indifference. In a world searching for scapegoats, Jews became the chosen victims. For survivors, the massacre of neighbors alongside the plague itself compounded the sense of divine abandonment. The Church, instead of protecting the persecuted, often joined the chorus of condemnation, though some popes and bishops did attempt to shield Jews. Faith fractured not only between individuals and God, but between Christians and their fellow men. Within monasteries, the losses were catastrophic. Orders such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, who lived among the people, died in vast numbers, leaving entire houses empty. This decimation eroded the spiritual vigor of monasticism for generations. Yet in some cases, new opportunities arose. Widows and orphans, seeking purpose, entered religious life, replenishing ranks with new devotion. The plague simultaneously destroyed and renewed, hollowed out and transformed. The cultural imagination absorbed the crisis into its art and literature. Images of the danse macabre spread across Europe. Skeletons leading kings, bishops, peasants, and children alike in the dance of death, a visual sermon that no one could escape mortality. Preachers thundered that the plague was divine judgment, but many believers saw in the universal mortality a deeper message. Death equalized all. This realization fostered both cynicism and humility. Some abandoned faith entirely, surrendering to hedonism. Others embraced a more personal piety, focusing less on institutions and more on direct communion with God. Mysticism flourished in this environment. Visionaries like Catherine of Siena rose in the aftermath, calling for reform and inner devotion. Devotional texts emphasized meditation on death and Christ's suffering. reflecting the trauma of the age. The plague reoriented Christianity toward a darker, more introspective spirituality, one obsessed with mortality yet hungry for meaning. The institutional church, though battered, endured. It consecrated new priests rapidly, filled empty sees, and adapted its rituals. But its credibility had been shaken. If God's vicar on earth could not halt the plague, if relics and indulgences proved useless, then what was the true nature of divine power? The seeds of doubt sown in 1348 would sprout in later centuries, contributing to the soil from which Reformation would grow. The symbolism of the death ships is essential to this crisis of faith. They represented the futility of human power. Mighty cities like Venice and Avignon fell not to war, but to silent vessels drifting with rats aboard. They also embodied the failure of spiritual authority, for no pope or priest could exorcise them. They seemed like omens sent from another world, reminders that the church, for all its wealth and grandeur, was as powerless as the humblest fisherman. Thus, Chapter 12 shows how the plague cracked the religious order of medieval Europe. Faith was not destroyed, but it was transformed. Shaken, darkened, radicalized. From the flagellants to pogroms, from deserted monasteries to new mysticism, the church's authority waned even as spirituality deepened in new forms. The death ships did more than carry fleas and corpses. They carried doubt, forcing Europe to reconsider the meaning of God's presence in a world drowning in death. When the death ships first arrived at Messina in 1347, Europe was a continent of rigid hierarchies. Kings ruled with divine sanction, nobles commanded vassals, peasants tilled fields bound by feudal obligations, and guilds enforced control of labor in towns. Society seemed fixed, ordained by heaven, unchanging through centuries. But as the Black Death swept across Europe, killing perhaps half the population within a few short years, these ancient structures cracked. Out of the silence of plague pits and the ruin of villages emerged a transformed society, scarred, restless, and reshaped by necessity. The first transformation was demographic. Mortality on such a scale had never been witnessed in living memory. Villages vanished, fields lay untended, monasteries stood deserted. In England alone, chroniclers estimated that entire parishes ceased to exist, their churches empty, their lands abandoned to weeds. Across France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, the same pattern unfolded. Estimates suggest that Europe's population fell from around 80 million to perhaps 40 or 45 million. Such depopulation carried immense consequences. Labor shortages became immediate and severe. Where once peasants had been plentiful and cheap, now survivors found themselves in demand. Lords desperate to harvest fields offered higher wages, reduced rents, and even freedom from certain feudal obligations. The rigid bonds of serfdom loosened as peasants gained bargaining power. In England, this shift alarmed the nobility. King Edward III responded with the Statute of Labourers in 1351, an edict attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But enforcement proved impossible. With so many dead, peasants could walk away from their lords, seeking better terms elsewhere. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Urban life, too, was transformed. In towns, guilds that had once monopolized trade struggled to replenish numbers. Survivors could demand entry more easily, weakening the exclusivity of craft traditions. Women, often widowed, stepped into roles previously barred to them, running workshops and businesses. In Florence and Venice, female merchants became more visible in records. Labor scarcity opened cracks in patriarchal norms, though the old order would push back fiercely in later centuries. Still, the plague had revealed the malleability of structures once thought eternal. The nobility, once secure, faced economic strain. With tenants dead and rents unpaid, their incomes dwindled. To maintain power, many increased demands on survivors, exacerbating tensions. In France, this contributed to the Jacquerie Uprising of 1358, when peasants rose violently against noble oppression. In England, resentment culminated in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when rebels marched on London demanding an end to serfdom. Though suppressed, these revolts revealed that the social compact had been rewritten by plague mortality. The death ships, though long gone, had sent aftershocks into the very fabric of society. The church, too, faced social consequences. Its credibility, shaken by the inability to halt the plague, weakened its grip. Survivors, skeptical of indulgences and clerical power, leaned more heavily on personal piety. Lay confraternities multiplied, groups of ordinary believers organizing their own devotions and charities. In some regions, anticlerical sentiment grew, fueled by resentment that many priests had fled their posts during the crisis. The social role of the church was not destroyed, but it was diluted, reshaped by a laity more confident and assertive. Cultural life reflected this transformation. Pre-plague Europe had been deeply communal, with festivals, guild gatherings, and religious processions binding people together. The Black Death introduced a darker tone. Death became a constant companion in art and literature, skeletal figures in Danse Macabre murals, poems meditating on the brevity of life, chronicles filled with mourning. Yet paradoxically, survivors often lived more intensely, embracing pleasures once considered sinful. Accounts describe feasting, drinking, and extravagant clothing, as if to seize life before death's next wave. The plague created not only fear but also urgency, an appetite for the present moment. Economically, the transformation was uneven but profound. In Western Europe, scarcity of labor increased wages and mobility. In Eastern Europe, however, nobles responded differently. Rather than loosening feudal bonds, they tightened them, binding peasants to the land more harshly. This divergence created the so-called Second Serfdom in Poland, Hungary, and parts of Germany, where peasantry lost freedoms even as their Western counterparts gained them. The plague had fractured Europe's social evolution, sending East and West down divergent paths that would shape centuries of history. The nobility also sought to reinforce their cultural dominance through displays of wealth. Surrounded by death, elites commissioned elaborate tombs, chantry chapels, and donations to monasteries to ensure remembrance and salvation. Yet even these displays betrayed insecurity. The very need for such monuments suggested an awareness of mortality that had unsettled the aristocracy's self-confidence. The family, too, was altered. With so many widows and orphans, households restructured. Inheritance patterns shifted as estates fragmented among fewer heirs. Marriage markets were reshaped, with widows often remarrying quickly to stabilize households. The demographic collapse altered kinship networks, leaving survivors with opportunities and burdens their ancestors had not imagined. One of the most striking transformations was psychological. Survivors of the plague bore scars invisible but enduring. Generations carried the memory of cartloads of corpses, of ghostly ships drifting into harbors, of mass graves and sudden death. This trauma reshaped attitudes toward life, work, and authority. The old certainties of feudal hierarchy and clerical dominance no longer felt immutable. If death could sweep away half of Europe in 3 years, what institution could truly claim divine permanence? The symbolism of the death ships resonates here. They were the first cracks in the old order, the silent harbingers that showed how fragile Europe's structures really were. No city was safe, no lord secure, no priest untouchable. When ghost ships drifted into Messina, when Bergen received a vessel crewed only by corpses, Europe glimpsed a truth that reverberated through its social order. Mortality was universal, and so too must power be reconsidered. Thus, Chapter 13 demonstrates how the plague reshaped society. The demographic collapse loosened feudal bonds in the West, hardened them in the East, empowered peasants and women, weakened nobles and clergy, and reoriented culture toward both despair and vitality. The death ships had carried more than disease. They had carried transformation. Out of their cargo of corpses emerged a new Europe, altered irreversibly, its old hierarchies fractured, its survivors tasked with rebuilding a world they no longer fully trusted. When the death ships drifted into Messina in 1347, they carried more than plague. They carried images so haunting that they would lodge themselves in Europe's collective imagination for centuries. Long after the last corpse was buried and the plague wave subsided, the memory of ghostly vessels, overflowing plague pits, and skeletal death dances lived on in stories, songs, art, and folklore. The Black Death became not just a demographic event, but a cultural one, reshaping how Europeans saw themselves, their mortality, and their relationship to God and fate. The earliest myths sprang directly from the ports that had first seen the death ships. In Sicily, sailors whispered of vessels still drifting, crewed not by men but by spirits of the dead. In Norway, tales grew of ships entering fjords with no living sailor aboard, only the creak of rigging and the stench of death. These ghost ship stories became part of seafaring folklore, blending with older superstitions about phantom vessels. Even centuries later, fishermen in the Mediterranean or North Sea told of plague ships that appeared on stormy nights, omens of bad fortune or impending sickness. The memory of the plague also left indelible marks on European art. The danse macabre, the dance of death, emerged in murals, manuscripts, and woodcuts. Skeletons led kings, bishops, peasants, and children alike in a grim procession, reminding viewers that death spared no one. These images were not confined to one region, but spread across France, Germany, and beyond. They transformed the horror of the plague into a universal allegory of mortality. Behind them lingered the memory of the death ships, the sight of bodies piled together, of nobles and sailors alike struck down, had made equality in death undeniable. Literature, too, absorbed the trauma. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in Florence after the Black Death, framed its tales within the story of young nobles fleeing the plague-ridden city to tell stories in the countryside. Though comic and romantic, its premise testified to the terror of urban collapse. In England, William Langland's Piers Plowman echoed themes of social upheaval and divine judgment, shaped by memories of plague years. Across Europe, sermons, chronicles, and poetry carried the imprint of catastrophe. Memory of the death ships became metaphor. Society itself seemed adrift, crewless, drifting toward unknown shores. Folklore localized the plague's horror. In German lands, stories spoke of the Pestjungfrau, the plague maiden, an apparition who entered villages bringing sickness. In Russia, legends described the plague as a dark rider sweeping across fields. In Norway, sagas spoke of ghost ships appearing in fjords. Though diverse, these myths shared a common thread. They gave shape to the invisible terror, turning bacteria and fleas into images that people could grasp. And at the heart of these images was always movement. Ships, riders, maidens, conveying the inescapable spread of death. Religious memory also transformed. Survivors interpreted the plague as a trial, a punishment, or a mystery. Some saw in their survival proof of divine mercy, leading to heightened piety. Others, embittered by the indiscriminate slaughter of priests and innocents, turned skeptical, doubting the church's authority. This ambivalence entered religious art. Christ depicted not only as Savior, but as judge. Mary not only as gentle mother, but as intercessor for the doomed. In prayers, one hears echoes of the plague's trauma. Pleas for sudden death to be averted, for protection from pestilence, for deliverance from unseen enemies. The death ships themselves became enduring symbols of doom. Mariners wove them into their lore, writers invoked them as metaphors, and painters occasionally depicted vessels adrift with corpses. Centuries later, when new epidemics struck, cholera in the 19th century, influenza in the 20th, journalists revived the imagery of plague ships drifting into port. The metaphor proved timeless. A ship with no living crew, silently carrying death, became shorthand for contagion itself. Memory of the plague also shaped festivals and rituals. In some towns, annual processions commemorated those lost, blending mourning with thanksgiving for survival. In others, shrines were built to saints believed to have interceded, such as Saint Roch or Saint Sebastian, both becoming plague patrons in European devotion. These cults flourished in the aftermath, their iconography steeped in the trauma of the 1340s. Saint Roch was often depicted showing his plague bubo, a direct link between saintly suffering and the common agony of the age. The mythologizing of the Black Death also served political ends. Some rulers claimed divine favor in surviving relatively unscathed. Poland's lighter losses, whether due to geography or luck, were remembered as evidence of God's protection for King Casimir's realm. Venice, devastated by plague, later reframed its survival as a sign of resilience. building churches like Santa Maria della Salute in thanksgiving for deliverance. Memory became part of civic identity, each city interpreting the plague's story to fit its sense of destiny. Over time, the death ships became part of Europe's larger folklore of the sea. Mariners told of the Flying Dutchman, a phantom vessel doomed to wander forever, its origins arguably rooted in plague ship imagery. The idea of ships as omens of doom, as bearers of death rather than wealth, lingered long after the Black Death itself had subsided. Memory and myth fused, blurring history with imagination, ensuring that the trauma of the 14th century was never entirely forgotten. The cultural imagination of the plague reveals how deeply the Black Death unsettled Europe. It was not merely a biological catastrophe, but a psychological one, forcing people to confront mortality in new ways. The death ships, in particular, embodied the helplessness of humanity against forces beyond comprehension. They were vessels of commerce turned into coffins, symbols of connection turned into omens of ruin. As symbols, they outlived the epidemic itself, haunting Europe's memory for generations. Thus, Chapter 14 shows how the Black Death, born on death ships, lived on in cultural imagination. In ghost ship tales, in Danse Macabre murals, in literature and folklore, the memory endured. The plague was not simply recorded in chronicles, it was etched into the very stories and images through which Europe understood itself. The death ships continued to drift, not across seas, but across centuries, haunting minds long after their sails had rotted away. When the first plague ships drifted into Messina's harbor in 1347, the Sicilians who recoiled from the corpses aboard could not have known they were witnessing the beginning of Europe's greatest demographic and cultural upheaval. Nor could the Genoese merchants fleeing Caffa, nor the Venetians who thought incense and quarantine could hold the tide, nor the Norwegians who watched a crewless ship slide silently into Bergen's harbor. Yet from these moments of terror, a legacy was born, one that would shape Europe for centuries. The death ships were not merely carriers of fleas and corpses. They became symbols of vulnerability, catalysts of transformation, and reminders that human power, however great, is always fragile before the forces of nature. The demographic legacy was the most immediate and obvious. Between 1347 and 1352, Europe may have lost between one-third and one-half of its population. Villages disappeared, fields returned to wilderness, cities emptied. In England, as much as half the population perished. In Norway, entire valleys were depopulated. In Italy, Florence may have lost 60% of its people. No war, no famine, no invasion had ever equaled such devastation. The memory of cartloads of corpses, of churches filled with the dead, of mass graves hastily dug, remained etched into collective memory. Generations carried the scars, both physical and psychological. Yet demographic collapse had paradoxical consequences. For survivors, opportunity arose. Labor scarcity allowed peasants to demand better wages and conditions, undermining the feudal system that had bound them. In Western Europe, serfdom weakened, mobility increased, and revolts, like England's Peasants' Revolt of 1381, signaled a new assertiveness among the lower classes. In Eastern Europe, however, nobles tightened control, creating this second serfdom that bound peasants even more tightly to the land. The death ships thus helped fracture Europe's social evolution, sending its regions down divergent paths. Economically, the plague disrupted trade but also forced innovation. In devastated towns, survivors inherited wealth, redistributing property and fueling new forms of consumption. Landowners shifted from grain cultivation, which required heavy labor, to pasture for sheep, feeding a growing wool trade. In Italy, merchant families like the Medici rose in the decades after the plague, exploiting new openings in finance and politics. The plague had leveled populations, but in doing so it had cleared space for new economic and political actors to emerge. Culturally, the death ships left a permanent mark on imagination. Art, literature, and religion absorbed the trauma. Murals of the Danse Macabre and sermons of universal death reflected the stark realization that mortality was inescapable. Writers like Boccaccio, Petrarch, and later Chaucer shaped literature around themes of love, loss, and transience. Skepticism toward clerical authority deepened, while lay devotion and mysticism flourished. The seeds of the Renaissance and Reformation found fertile soil in the doubts and disruptions sown by the Black Death. Politically, the plague weakened monarchies and nobles alike. Kings who fled their capitals, popes who hid behind walls of fire, nobles who failed to protect their peasants, all lost legitimacy. New forms of governance emerged, some more centralized, others more communal. In Florence and Venice, merchant republics adapted. In France and England, monarchies eventually recovered, but the 100 Years' War was shaped profoundly by plague losses. Armies shrank, taxation faltered, rebellions multiplied. The death ships, though long vanished, had tilted the political balance of Europe. Spiritually, the legacy was one of both doubt and renewal. The Church had failed to stop the plague, its relics and indulgences powerless. Faith in clerical authority declined, yet individual piety often deepened. New cults of plague saints, such as Saint Roch and Saint Sebastian, flourished. Mystics like Catherine of Siena and Meister Eckhart inspired followers with visions of a more direct, personal faith. The death ships had not destroyed Christianity, but they had transformed it, setting the stage for centuries of religious turbulence. The memory of the ships themselves became legend. To contemporaries, they were omens of apocalypse, floating coffins that entered harbors silently, bringing only rats and death. Sailors retold stories of ghost ships, crewed by the dead, drifting forever on stormy seas. Folklore absorbed the image, and even centuries later, tales of phantom vessels, the Flying Dutchman among them, echoed the memory of plague ships. They were remembered as symbols of unseen contagion, reminders that danger could arrive silently, unbidden, borne not by armies but by the invisible. The legacy of the death ships also lies in their lesson about interconnectedness. The very networks of trade and pilgrimage that enriched Europe carried its ruin. The ships of Genoa and Venice that once brought spices and silks became vectors of death. The plague revealed that prosperity and vulnerability were two sides of the same coin. That connection bound not only wealth but mortality. In this sense, the death ships were harbingers of the modern world, where globalization brings both fortune and fragility. For survivors, the trauma bred a new relationship with time itself. Life felt shorter, more precarious. The urgency of art, of pleasure, of reform, all reflected a generation that had seen half its world vanish. The death ships had shown them that life could end suddenly, unpredictably, with no explanation but fate. Out of that awareness came both despair and creativity. The Europe that emerged from the Black Death was not the same Europe that had welcomed those first silent vessels into Messina. It was poorer, scarred, but also more dynamic, restless, and prepared for change. Thus, Chapter 15 closes the saga by tracing the legacy of the death ships. They were more than drifting coffins. They were symbols of transformation. They humbled kings, weakened churches, fractured feudalism, inspired art, and reshaped economies. They became part of folklore, myth, and cultural memory. Above all, they revealed humanity's fragility in the face of unseen forces, a lesson that echoes whenever ships carry contagion, whenever disease crosses borders, whenever humanity remembers how easily fortune can turn to ruin. The death ships of 1347 were the beginning of Europe's darkest chapter, but also the catalyst for the birth of something new. Out of their silence came screams, and out of their screams came change. Their legacy endures not only in history books, but in the very structures of modern Europe, built atop the bones they left behind. The death ships of 1347 drifted silently into Europe's harbors, their sails tattered, their decks strewn with corpses. To contemporaries, they seemed like omens of divine wrath, vessels sent by demons or by God himself. To historians, they remain the most haunting symbols of the Black Death, the plague's first messengers, carrying not armies or kings but rats, fleas, and a bacterium too small to see, yet strong enough to topple half a continent. Their legacy is not just the horror they spread, but the transformations they unleashed. The Black Death was, above all, a lesson in fragility. Cities like Venice and Paris, kingdoms like England and Hungary, the papacy and Avignon, all discovered that wealth, power and faith offered no shield against invisible enemies. Ships that once carried silk and spice carried ruin instead, showing that prosperity and vulnerability are inseparable twins. The very networks that made Europe rich, the ports, the markets, the pilgrim roads, became the arteries of its undoing. The death ships embodied this paradox, instruments of connection that became harbingers of isolation, progress turned to apocalypse. Yet the legacy of the death ships is not only devastation. They forced transformation. By emptying villages and fields, they shattered feudal bonds and gave peasants leverage. By killing clergy in droves, they weakened trust in institutions and redirected faith inward. By haunting art and literature with images of ghost ships and death dances, they reshaped Europe's imagination, binding it closer to mortality and urgency. From the trauma of plague arose new economies, new politics, and eventually the cultural flowering of the Renaissance. The death ships carried not only death, but also the seeds of change. They also remind us of humanity's endless search for meaning in catastrophe. Medieval Europe saw them as omens, punishments, or curses. Later centuries turned them into legends. Ghost ships drifting forever, warnings of doom. Even now, their image lingers, revived whenever disease arrives silently at a border, whenever ships or planes carry contagion across seas. The metaphor endures because it is true. In every age, humanity builds vessels to connect itself, and in every age, those same vessels can betray us, carrying unseen passengers that remind us of our mortality. In the end, the death ships are more than history. They are symbols of a truth as old as humanity, that we are fragile creatures in a vast, unpredictable world. No wall is high enough, no harbor strong enough, no faith unshakable enough to make us invulnerable. But they also remind us of resilience. Europe survived the Black Death, scarred but transformed. Out of drifting coffins came new societies, new art, new ways of living. The death ships brought ruin, but they also forced renewal. Today, we can still hear their timbers creaking in memory. They drift through history's imagination as ghostly silhouettes, reminders of a time when half of Europe vanished, when ships became coffins, when the very waters carried death. And yet, behind the silence of those vessels lies a deeper lesson. Even in catastrophe, humanity endures, adapts, and finds meaning. The death ships may have carried plague, but they also carried us into a new world.